our next session, which is a keynote fireside chat. The keynote speaker in this one is Aparna Chennapragada. She is the vice president at Google and general manager who also serves on the board of Capital One. In her current role, Aparna leads consumer shopping platforms and experiences across Google. She also drives Google's visual search and AR efforts. She previously worked as a senior director and technical assistant to the CEO of Google. Aparna has a master's in management and engineering from MIT, a master's in computer science from the University of Texas at Austin, and a bachelor's in computer science from IIT Madras. Moderating this fireside chat is Arvind Purushotham, who leads the corporate venture capital group at Citi. In this role, Arvind leads Citi's efforts to invest in and partner with leading startups to bring technology-based innovation to Citi's products, businesses, and functions. His investments span fintech, cybersecurity, and enterprise infrastructure. Arvind obtained his bachelor's in EE from IIT Madras, a master's in EE from Case Western, and an MBA with distinction from Harvard Business School. He enjoys running, photography, reading in his spare time. I guess he's got a little extra spare time during this year. Arvind is passionate about golf and is working very hard on getting his skill level to match his passion. He lives in the Bay Area with his wife, 2 sons, and their black lab, Rocky. As for all the other sessions, as you watch this keynote, please submit your questions in the Q&A window. The speakers will address these questions offline following the event. Over to Arvind now.
Thank you, Naren, and thank you to the organizers for doing this during difficult times. And sounds like it's we're in the middle of a really great event here. And good morning and hello to you, Aparna, as well. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk to Aparna because of where you sit, Aparna. I mean, not only is Google where you can get some of the leading indicators of what's happening out there because of search and YouTube and some of the consumer trends and that you see, but it's also a very progressive and forward-thinking company when it comes to applying technology to how Google thinks about work and work and managing during these pandemic times. And you've made some announcements and some decisions there as well. So I'm super excited to be talking to you today. Maybe to begin with, would love to hear a little bit more about sort of how you got here. I think Naren went through some of that, but maybe talk a little bit about some of the important projects you worked on at Google and what got you to this spot, and then we can talk about the new normal after that.
Sounds good, Arvind. First of all, hi to everyone, and kudos to the organizers. This is a great example of rolling with the punches and figuring out the virtual session across continents, across time zones. So thanks for that, and I hope everyone in the community is safe and well. I've got to say that my journey began in IITM, so I have to first say that, props to all of us in the community, whether it be in the classes or, more likely the bun omelette sessions in Tarams and chai sessions in Quark. But I think over the years, since my education, I've spent over 20 years or so as an engineer, product leader, business leader in tech. But one steel thread I would say that just runs through it is this idea of how do you have AI, or more broadly, actually, data and algorithms, and how do you build products rooted in deep data and algorithms, but then actually have very broad consumer impact. So I cut my teeth in Google search for many years, worked on YouTube. But 2 things I'd highlight are, one, I worked on what became the precursor to the Google Assistant, and this idea being, hey, our smartphones are not really that smart. we ought to be able to like say, hey, we give you information without you having to ask for it, or being able to like speak to the computer in a conversational, natural way and get back answers, get back information. So that's one of the areas that I've been passionate about. And I think the second area is when I was working as the technical advisor, really trying to look around the corners and say, okay, as companies become bigger, they're become kind of siloed into different areas, but how do you connect the dots and see what's around the corner? And one of the areas, for example, I spotted was this idea of the camera being the new keyboard or the cursor for many folks in our generation, but more, obviously in the next generation, where the camera is the way that communication happens. So one of the products we work on is this idea of visual search and Google Lens, being able to point the camera and get information about the world.
Oh, that's fantastic, and a great set of experiences during a very interesting time, Aparna. But maybe start talking about personal life, right? Like what's changed for you during the pandemic? What are some of the good habits, perhaps, or maybe not so good habits that you've picked up, during the pandemic?
I have to confess, Arvind, I'm neither the passion nor the skill for golf. Let's get that out there. I do have a lot of passion for Netflix and Amazon Prime, for what it's worth. I was joking with someone the other day saying, I think the baking is the in thing to do. But for me, I think I'm fine with just watching the baking shows. I'm good with that. I did take up one hobby, which has been extremely fun for me. Like, just I've evolved from bathroom singing to all rooms singing, anywhere from like old Ilayaraja songs to like latest Bollywood songs. It's been very de-stressing for me, but very distressing for the family, I have to admit.
Yeah, totally get that. Actually, I have the same experience, by the way, at our household. But that actually brings us to one of the important things we wanted to talk about, right? And in your position and from what you see out there, what are some of the consumer behavior changes that you've been thinking about? What do you see that's relevant to your work that could be pretty interesting to the audience to hear about?
I mean, I'm going to start with the Department of Obvious, right? Everyone said it. The previous panel, had really good insights on this is a once in a century kind of a shift, right? At a situation that we are in. So there's a lot of shifts in consumer behavior, right? So for example, like instead of going to a restaurant, you order food. Instead of going to shop in a mall or a store, you shop online. Instead of going to school, you resort to the online learning or distant learning or no learning in some cases. But it's been in this synchronous, at scale, unnatural shift, right? So to me, the interesting question is, well, okay, so then what parts of these shifts are kind of the secular, persistent ones that, last beyond COVID? And which ones are the temporary trends? There's been dams put on kind of certain natural consumer behavior. And then once the dams are lifted, the previous panel talked about how, working, right? So working remote. So that I think is one question to kind of maybe like probe a little bit. And on the first one, right, this idea of like these secular shifts, certainly like I work on shopping, the way I think about it is a dramatic acceleration and compression of the inevitable, right? So it's clear for many people in the audience, for all of us, that of course, there's been a gradual shift to shopping online, but what is projected to be in years is happening in weeks, right? So consumers are shifting massively online. And I think one interesting thing that I've observed in the data we see is that they have a very seamless view, right? So they're like, hey, I want to buy on X, Y, and Z, like whether it's an air purifier or a single serve coffee press. They go online, but they also expect to see options where they can pick up, buy online and pick up in store. And so what's been interesting to see is how retailers can adapt to that. Right. So I think, we talked about this idea of like, the word omni-channel gets thrown around quite a bit, but it's real for many retailers, right?
Yeah. And for bigger retailers to do it is one thing, but for smaller stores to do it is a whole different ballgame, and the challenges are also very, very different, isn't it?
Yeah, spot on. I mean, look, the retail business has become suddenly and overnight a software and a data business, right? So for many folks, actually even the big ones, they've been traditionally offline first and online maybe, or online sort of. And then it's just flipped, right? It's online first and offline maybe at some point in the future. And so I do think even brands, for example, even brands that have been traditionally selling through retailers, every brand has to think like a DTC, direct to consumer brand, because they have to figure out the online presence, right? For small guys, I agree with you. It's a bit more of a challenge, but I think this is where I think Google, Shopify is another example of all these platforms emerging to help the small guys and say, hey, what is this one click? You instantly like become e-commerce ready, because otherwise you're not in business.
Right. I mean, to add to what you just said in terms of consumer behavior, I work at Citibank, and we obviously have millions of customers around the world, and the mobile banking has been growing rapidly, even in the pre-pandemic days, right? I mean, there's massive increase in usage of the mobile app, but there was always that sliver of the population that was never going to do mobile banking, right? And that's not there anymore, right? This is 70, 75-year-old people who probably didn't, really want to do, mobile banking because there was a certain way that they were used to doing banking, are suddenly asking, how to get onto their mobile phones, onto the mobile bank, and sort of do mobile banking. And so, to your point about, acceleration and compression of timelines is something that we're seeing as well in our own business.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the, I mean, if 2 years ago, like we were sitting around and saying, okay, you know what the category of that will shift, that will have the biggest jump in going online? Groceries. We wouldn't have thought that. So I think there's a lot of it that's an unnatural beginning here. But my instinct and kind of like everything that we see here is that this one's here to stay, because it is law of user physics. It's cheaper, faster, more convenient. It's asynchronous, so it's going to stay.
Right. And anything that you can talk about, of course, to the extent that you can, in terms of YouTube data or search data or anything there that could be pretty interesting for this audience as far as what Google sees?
I think maybe there may be a broader thing that you see certainly with YouTube, but also just like with other tools that Google has, and obviously broader tools like Zoom, etc., is this idea of how learning is changing. So it's not, of course, YouTube is not just learning, as I will vouch for it. There's a lot more there, but I think it's along with the obvious of like spike in Netflix, spike in YouTube. Is instead of going and meeting people, we're sitting and watching videos. So there's clearly that spike. But I do think when it comes to learning, there's again a similar phenomenon, right? So it is not as dramatic acceleration as the shopping use cases or behaviors, but again, like there's been this synchronous experiment. Everyone's trying to figure out how to do this distance learning. So I do see, again, like post-COVID, there'll be a hybrid model. The big challenge here is that the tools are not there, right? YouTube videos or Google Classroom or Zoom, they're all kind of like, it almost feels like we're building a school out of Legos, right? Like the tools aren't quite there. And so that actually for many of us tuning in, I think that's an opportunity for folks who are builders and engineers, is what is the education stack, and like what parts of that education stack can be really rethought and built for purpose for this hybrid world.
Have you seen in that arena? Have you seen anything new come out during these last 7-8 months? Anything interesting that somebody has done or experimented with even that has worked out really well?
I think I have to say there's a lot more of I'd say the homework help kind of, there's already existing apps, the pre-pandemic. So for example, in Google, we launched some features to help with, if you take a picture of a homework problem, it'll connect you to concepts, or like AR models of hard to understand concepts, so that, if you're not in school and if you're not actually physically looking at things. Outside of Google, though, there are a couple of areas where there is exciting work going on. One is this custom built, think of it as on Zoom or on video conferencing layer. Can you build one-on-one tutoring sessions? Can you build features dedicated to teaching, etc.?
Yeah, actually, something that we didn't speak about earlier, Aparna, but what you just mentioned AR, right? And one thought that occurred to me is whether, the pandemic is kind of the trigger function for like large scale uses of AR and VR technology. I mean, if you think about it, still not, mature in many ways. It's expensive, hard to come across use cases that really leverage what AR or VR can do. I mean, I know you work in that area. Are you seeing any early signs of the pandemic being the, sort of the positive breakthrough for AR VR technologies?
I think, look, I mean, it's been this novelty, and like, it's a few years from now for a few decades, right? And that's the kind of, there are a few technologies like that. Are we in the kind of the Newton phase versus the iPad phase? Certainly somewhere in between, I would say,
Right.
Meaning I think it's like we are seeing use cases where folks are using AR for particularly like products. If you can't walk into the store, like being able to see models of it, or see how the Nespresso machine looks on the counter, those kinds of examples. I do think fast forward a few years, if you have a storeless future, right? I do think we have to, whether it's AR, whether it's a lot more imagery and like more of human voices, you do need a way to really experience products. Think about apparel, think about, like beauty and makeup, for example. So we do have like opportunities there, I think.
Right. The other thing that obviously has changed dramatically since the pandemic started is travel. And Google has played, plays and has played a big role in that vertical, in that industry. Any thoughts from you on what you're seeing there in that arena?
Look, I mean, I'll start with the expected, right? Which is there's a big dip in travel, we're all in mid-air suspension at this point. But this is one of those examples where we were talking about how some of these shifts will be persistent and others may be kind of more elastic. Right. I do think this is one of those cases. It's such a fundamental need to go meet people, see the world, and there's only so much Netflix you can watch that I do think that it'll come back with a vengeance, right? I think people will, once they're allowed to do that. And even there, you're starting to see some early green shoots of like slightly different interesting behavior, which is the radius of travel. So even in these areas, even in this situation where, people are kind of, there's a lot more interest in local travel, meaning, around your neighborhood, a lot more of like camping interest. Now, that may not be sustainable, right? Once people are able to travel longer distances, they will. But I think even like to your point about travel, the other thing that we see is, people are actually looking up how busy an area is, how busy a transit station is, right? So it's a very COVID specific, kind of behavior. Hopefully folks don't have to do that after some time. Right.
This camping and sort of RVing, like all of that seems to be back in fashion, right? And we were having a discussion within my group on, what are some of those trends and how is pandemic impacting those trends, and so somebody sort of did a 2x2 on sort of trends that were already happening versus, trends where they were going down, right? So a lot of usage was going down, and then pandemic was, how the pandemic impacted it. So I asked the question, what was a trend that was kind of going away that is now back, right, because of COVID? One example is drive-in theaters. People are sort of back to, somewhat nostalgic, I guess, but now necessary given that. And then the other one that somebody talked about was rollerblades, because people can't exercise, can't go to the gyms, and rollerblades were sort of a waning trend, and now they're back. And so it's, bringing some interesting consumer behavior and needs to the fore. So I think it's going to be interesting to see again, secular versus temporary sort of changes in behavior. The other thing that I was going to bring up, and even in the last panel, there was a lot of talk of work and working in the new normal, and recruiting as well. Anything that you can talk about, especially things that you've seen Google do as a company that, could be interesting for other people in at least in the knowledge industry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was really keenly listening into the last panel, because I think the cliched stuff comes out, right? Which is, of course, this is hard at a personal level. Obviously, like, there are clearly downsides to this. People talk about Zoom fatigue, or just this idea of, it goes against thousands of years of evolution to be like intently staring at, at the screen, and, just the face of many, many folks throughout the day. And a lot of the nonverbal cues get lost. Maybe I'll actually start with a couple of upsides that I've seen at Google. And then, some observations, some hacks that have probably, might be useful for others to hear. I think one upside I do see is that, I think Roni touched on it in the previous panel, this idea of being able, traditionally it's been hard for folks who have been in the distributed offices or in the remote offices. COVID plus cloud has been the great leveler, right? So I think, I see this actually at Google, I see this at Capital One, where the companies have been able to make a very easy transition because fundamentally it's a knowledge-based work. And so instantly everybody is distributed, right? Versus this hierarchy that inherently exists wherever you have a center of gravity in one location. So I think that's one of the upsides, meaning everyone's has been forced to think about, even in meetings, even in planning sessions, to use a lot more online tools, a lot more written communication, right? Now, one could argue, well, that slows down some in the very, very short term. But I actually think at a large scale, now this may be different for a startup, but I think at a large scale, when you have these multi-year plans and a lot more coordination, I think this has been a great forcing function, right? So that's one. I think the other upside I see is this, one way to put this is the TAM, the total addressable market of like communication, because it's asynchronous, communication, interaction, all of that has gone up, right? So previously I felt like there were a lot of things that we would say, oh yeah, like let's have an in-person offsite to go figure that out. Well, guess what? We can't do that. So let's unbundle these things and say, maybe you have pairwise conversations here. You use chat a lot more. We've even done like in a couple of cases where there's really this brainstorming mindset you need to get into, which has been the hardest. We've done a virtual offsite where really it's not an offsite. You're sitting in your pajamas at home, but you're kind of like at least like mentally away from the day-to-day work. And you have like whiteboards on your side, and they have like whiteboard tools, and get into the mix of it. I've been pleasantly surprised, I have to say, with that.
Yeah, I mean, again, we think about this quite a bit also, given that Citi is we're very, very global, and in 90 plus countries on the ground, et cetera, et cetera. So to some extent, we've always operated in a remote friendly environment. And one of the things that we've talked about is, I'm here in the Bay Area, the headquarters is in New York, but suddenly it doesn't matter, right? You're also a rectangle on Zoom, just like everybody else is. So why don't we leverage that and use that as an advantage, given that we're all in this, situation anyway, right? So that's the other way to think about it.
Yeah, spot on. And I think,
being a leveler, right?
Yep. I in fact, actually, like even on the hiring and recruiting front, I think that's another opportunity for all of us to kind of think about. I do think actually, like now you have again the TAM of reachable audience or candidates is a lot higher, and again it is actually one of these areas where it can help underrepresented folks more. There are no networking sessions over happy hours or so you're forced to kind of think about how do you connect with all of these folks, and like it may not be as extreme as the world as one single zip code. There are still kind of like networks that are not connected, but I do think I see that in Google, where we are able to be more flexible in terms of really specialized talent that happens to be in Arizona, and like there's no obvious office there, but hey, like we don't know where we'll be for a year or so we might as well actually like take that off the table.
Yeah, I think I was talking to you a little bit about the what I think of as the Apollo 13 problem, right? And, like, can you try to solve the problem that these astronauts were facing and NASA faced in bringing the Apollo 13 astronauts home if you were doing it on Zoom, right? And that seems really difficult and probably, not doable, right? So I think there are situations where maybe you're
no,
working on
Arvind,
hardware.
you just use the raise the hand feature.
Exactly. And so you may not have any examples, but have you had, in the last 7-8 months, what you would think of as sort of tough engineering problems or even business problems that have been solved through sort of the virtual and remote means?
Yeah, and I do think there are these two classes of problems, right? So one where there's existing relationships, existing even like the formative stages have been pre-COVID. So I think those things to other folks who have said, the productivity has actually increased because again, like you were able to shard the problems, folks have been able to do it. I think the other class of problems where you're either forming new ideas, brainstorming new plans, or in some cases, in my own personal case, I started, working with new teams across 2 to 3 different time zones, all not unknown to me before. And so those have been challenging. The one hack that, at least in the brainstorming thing that I've seen it somewhat work. Now there's no A/B test around this yet, but I think it somewhat work is this idea of really small group. So instead of these like large group brainstorming sessions, which again, they weren't as effective even in person, doing a lot more social engineering, right? Like actually identify the group of folks and do probably we've had to do double the work, I would say, because it's like a hierarchical, like get all the inputs, then kind of process it, and then get a few more folks, few small set of folks together to come up with ideas, and a lot more written communication. That I don't think is the solution. I hope not, which is why I think there's a yes and here post-COVID, right? There's got to be an hybrid model. But as these things go, I think like every time there's a big shift, folks think about like either it is reversal to the previous or like a completely new world. I think my own thing is there will be a yes and, meaning there are new things that are possible and done so much more efficiently because of the learned behavior during this time. But I think then, there are certain things that can only be done the old school way, right?
Right.
I have to say one thing though, Arvind, I do observe, for example, like I wonder whether there's a difference between how we think about this versus say, companies or even like in the next generation of like folks who are working on problems that are in fundamentally distributed ground up situations, whether there are behaviors and even tools that start to emerge there, right?
Start to emerge there, right? I mean, it's necessarily the mother of invention. So you start to sort of develop new things and innovate there. One of the things that I think about is, my company as well and how we reacted during COVID. And I don't know if there's anything about Cap One that you can talk about during this Capital One that you can talk about. But I think during the early days of the pandemic, and even to this day, to some extent, we have shipped home 50,000 plus pieces of equipment to people to be able to work, right? And this includes traders who have a lot of specialized, compute, 5, 6 screens, and sort of the feeds that are coming in there, et cetera. Like this was all shipped home so that they could actually work from home, which they did for many months. The other large population that needed to work from home is customer service reps, right? In our industry, highly regulated. It's not easy to do that. That's something that we accelerated. And so now we have customer service reps working from home. I'm sure you've seen some of that happen at Capital One as well.
Yeah, totally. I think it's exactly this, which is, I think it does help that the company was all in on cloud, pre-COVID. So there's and a lot of the technology associates in the company would already do that. But there's been a big heavy lift, right? To make sure that the company can support both. The customer service is a key element here, and there's such specialized equipment, specialized software, all of that to like be able to like plug and play is not easy. But in the process, actually, that's an opportunity for folks to think about too, right? Folks, we talk at a 50,000 feet level about the digital transformation or digitization. Like, what are specific problems in fintech or specific problems in certain industry that you can just go and help solve these tools that just like make that offline to online work.
Yeah.
One other thought that occurred to me is, we talk a lot about hey, like how would the productivity work or how would the remote work happen? On the consumer side, I do think people have like adapted quite well to like doing things online that they're so used to doing offline. So I do think actually, even on the productivity side, to your point about necessity being the mother of invention, once we have the right tools, people do have like very rich interaction on WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram. So the equivalent will happen. We talk about consumerization of enterprise, but this is one of those themes, I think. Like, how do you actually have the social fabric of an enterprise? There's an opportunity there in terms of tools that can help there.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that we think about in our business, in venture, is traditionally it used to be that you want to be 5 miles away from your startup companies as a venture capitalist, right? Especially in early stage venture. Right? Well, what does that mean anymore, right? And people are moving out in droves from the Bay Area for all the reasons that we see in the news. And so that world has definitely changed. And you can't really say, well, I need you to be here in San Francisco or something, because I need to be able to see you and meet you every this one. All bets are off, right? Whereas the funding environment continues like crazy even during this time. Listen, just watching the clock here. Any parting thoughts? Anything? I mean, it sounds like we're all in some at least listening to the last session and talking to you, Aparna, that there are certain things that will stick. Life will be different even after the COVID ends, hopefully with sort of the vaccines and everything. And it also creates some opportunities for entrepreneurs to actually facilitate and enhance this remote world that we live in, right?
Yeah, I think I'd say like two things, right? So one is for us all to say, hey, opportunity happens either when there's a discontinuity or there's a change in pace of growth of a natural phenomenon. So I do think when you think about shopping, when you think about learning, I think this commerce stack and education stack, there's massive opportunity for all of us, building stuff, to think about whether you're in a big company or a small company. There's tons of opportunity to tune into, I'd say. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is, there's clearly downsides to the way we work and adapting that. But again, there's an opportunity for tools there to think about, hey, like how would we do this right, hybrid model in terms of like remote work and rather distributed work. I do have to say on a personal level, one upside has been having lunch with family. So I don't know how long that will last, but I think I'm making full use of it. Again, I don't know if my 12-year-old will think the same, that it's an upside or a downside. I'm not sure, but it's an upside for us.
No, it certainly has been great to have the kids at home for sure. Well, with that, thank you very much for spending your Sunday morning with us, and a great talk to you and hearing about some of your thoughts. With that, let me hand it back to Naren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Arvind. You both brought very good perspectives about what's happening in the new normal in a different area from what was discussed in the previous panel. Thanks again.